Okay, I would like to welcome everyone who have joined us this afternoon on this beautiful day. Thank you for joining us. It can be a temptation to go for a walk or something like that, but you're all here today to listen to some really insightful people today to talk about the situation of immigrants and refugees, not just in Canada, but as a global situation. I know it's been for many of us a real concern. What's the future of all of these dynamics going on our planet in terms of people's movements and stuff? A lot of it is for many different reasons. Nevertheless, I'd like to begin now. My name is Father Daryl Winkler. I'm the pastor of St. Basil's Parish, where we have started this Zoom series during the pandemic. It was the reason we started a Zoom series is because we wanted to have a lecture series on the 60th anniversary of our parish. We were going to have a lecture series. And then guess what happens? The pandemic happens. And so there's no more possibility of having a lecture series. So we learned how to do this. It's been very much trial and error, how to have these kinds of presentations on Zoom. We've tried webinars and Zoom meetings, and now we are happy to have. We at St. Basil's Parish, we all regard in our community the love of God to be the foundation of all life and ministry. We believe in the ever-present love of God as witnessed through Christ and empowered by the Holy Spirit. We believe that each person is loved by God and is of sacred worth. Therefore, through God's grace, we do our best to welcome all persons to our parish. We express God's hospitality by creating a safe, healing, accessible, and transforming place for all who come to us. Further, we acknowledge with gratitude and respect that we gather here at St. Basil's Parish on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin First Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory, and we uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. And now I would like to turn it over to Bob Cherney, who is our technical support for this gathering this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. I'll tell you very quickly what our agenda is. After I've made my little opening remarks on technical issues, Jean-Paul Ruszkowski will introduce our three speakers. They will speak for a total of about 35 minutes. Then we'll have a question and answer period moderated by Kathleen Monk. So a little bit over an hour from now, all of that will finish. Terry Tunney will thank our speakers, and Father Daryl will come back on for a closing of the session, and we'll end at 4 o'clock. So please just listen and stay muted all the time. And if you have a question or a comment, put it in the chat box. There are a lot of people online now. There's 89 of us, 90. Here we go. And so it's just not feasible to keep opening up the floor to just everybody randomly. So what we do is we try and combine questions thematically and make sure that we cover all the topics that we can within the time available. So please do use the chat box and do that at any time. You don't have to wait until one or another speaker has finished. Also, if you wish a particular panelist to answer a particular question, then do mention that. So now I would like to hand it over to Jean-Paul to introduce our panelists.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm a member of the parish, and I have been asked to introduce the panelists and our moderator. So the presentations will be in the reverse order of their speaking order. So start with Dr. Minh, who, after time in 4 refugee camps in Indonesia, she was finally sponsored by a community in Quebec. With multiple academic degrees and achievements, she's developed a successful research career. Now she's retired, but she still had major contribution to make when we had the Syrian refugee crisis. So she has a very sort of practical experience of how to integrate into Canadian society. The other speaker will be Norbert. He's the director of the Jesuit Refugee Service of Canada. His vocation is to accompany and to be accompanied by refugees. So he's done this since 1994 in Casa Romero in Toronto, and his story is one of great trust in God and working to defend and accompany people who have been marginalized, just as Jesus was. The main speaker, this is the extraordinary moment for me to introduce a Canadian icon. She has so many achievements that it's very difficult to summarize briefly what she has done, but I'm sure that most of you have known her either through her work at the Supreme Court of Canada, or as a prosecutor of war crimes, or as president of the crisis group, or as special representative of the international migration to the United Nations Secretary General. Louise is probably one of the best known Canadian jurists globally. And I have to assure you that when I met Louise for the first time, I was very much aware that I was in front of a very strong leader. I think transparency is also another one of her great attributes, and she will be answering your questions very directly and honestly. And I think that we are very privileged to have all three panelists and Louise Arbour in particular. What I would like is to finish by saying a few words about Kathleen Monk. She's a public affairs political commentary observer and commentator. And she is a member of our parish. And she's asked me to be very brief, so I stopped here. Over to you, Kathleen.
Well, welcome everyone. And I just want to echo what Father Daryl said, that it's such a beautiful day today. And apparently the magnolias are already smelling quite fragrant and gorgeous. So thank you for coming in from your gardens and joining us today. It's actually quite heartening to see the number of people that have joined us online. I am going to actually be brief in my remarks so we can get right to the presentations. We all know that our church, St. Basil's Parish, has a long history in supporting refugees and immigrants. And with that, I'd like to just open it up actually and ask Louise, who I've been given permission to call her by her first name. I just want to note that. Louise, to please take the floor and begin your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kathleen. And before I get into my presentation, just as a footnote to a text that I haven't started, I should mention that the only reason I accepted the Secretary General's invitation to lead the effort in 2017 to look at international migration is because Jean-Paul had persuaded me several years before to speak on migration issue at a time where I knew absolutely nothing about it and resisted vigorously. But eventually I had to yield to his persuasive attitude. And this led me to do a little bit of research to build some confidence. So when the big call came, I thought, well, this time I think I could do it. I've learned a ton more in doing the work I did on international migration, which led to the Global Compact that the United Nations put together. So what I thought I would do today is try to situate that a little bit on this global picture. I'll throw a couple of numbers at you, because I think that when we're struggling with some very specific issues or policy tensions, it's very useful to take a step back and try to remember how this is situated more globally. So that's why I've entitled my remarks today, The Pushes and Pulls of International Migration. There's a ton of information. As I was refreshing my memory, I looked at a couple of documents, and for those of you who may be interested in digging deeper into these issues, the latest report by IOM, the International Organization of Migration, which is a 2022 report, is extremely well done, informative. I would also recommend you could look at UNDESA, United Nations Department of Social and Economic Affairs. Very good, particularly on demographics, which is a big part of this debate. The World Bank has very good materials particularly on remittances, and I'll talk a bit about that. And of course, UNHCR, I think, is the go-to place on refugee issues. So a couple of things. First of all, I think it's interesting that all the literature usually starts with this remark that humans are migratory. Not everybody is Vasco da Gama or Christopher Columbus, but people move. They move not very far away, they move a little farther away, and then they've moved over time across the globe, which I think accounts for where we stand today. However, currently, only about 3.6% of the world's population are international migrants. Now, in the literature, the convention is to call an international migrant a person who has lived for more than 1 year in a country other than their country of origin. It's very loose. Obviously, it excludes tourists. It may or may not include international students, but the convention is, that's what we call international migrants. So 3.6% of the world's population. In 2022, certainly that's the number I got in the IOM report, which was the latest, they were in the world today 281 million international migrants, of which the vast majority are labor migrants, and of which there are 135 million women. And just a little footnote here, contrary to a lot of assumptions, women actually do move on their own, not always just part of a family. You could only think, for instance, at the large number of Filipino women who migrate and work abroad, sometimes for decades, and in a somewhat untypical pattern with the intention of going back home, which they often do, even after decades of working abroad, mostly in domestic work, in the Western countries, and of course, in the Gulf countries. Of these 281 million international migrants, currently about 29, little over 29 million are refugees. Now, in addition to refugees, we have other classes of migrants that are similar to refugees: stateless people, people whose nationality is undefined or undocumented, so stateless people, asylum seekers, people who are not quite yet defined as refugees, but are asserting their entitlement to international protection. And then we have, of course, the large number of internally displaced people, people who look like refugees, live in camps in a lot of cases, but in fact are displaced within their own countries. And if you think of Darfur, for instance, in the Sudan, that's one of the many, many examples. Now, I'd like to move to another set of numbers that I think are really significant, particularly when we have a lot of unhelpful discussion about the economics of migration, and that is the issue of remittances. So these 281 million migrants in the world today collectively send back home in the form of what we call remittances, that is very often small amounts of money that periodically migrants send back to their home country, to their children, to their parents, their communities, and sometimes to build a nest egg for their eventual return. And again, I think the example of Filipino women is a case in point. Remittances, in the number I have is for 2020, amounted to $700 billion, of which 450 billion go to developing countries, because as I'll point out later, a lot of migration is between rich countries, and rich people who move to other rich countries often still send money home. So that's a form of remittance. But so $450 billion were sent by international migrants to developing countries. That sum together is 3 times the total amount of official international development aid that rich countries send to the developing world. In other words, international development is financed overwhelmingly by private money from very often not very rich people, that is migrants, much more so than by governments from rich countries. I'd like to say a few things now about who migrates and where do they go. So first, I think that one thing that has to be made clear is to avoid stereotypes. many countries are all at once countries of origin, transit, and destination. I mean, classical cases, Mexico. Mexico is a country of origin for migration. It's a country of transit from Latin and Central America into North America. And it's actually a country of destination, sometimes not by choice, by default, when people can't either finance their moving further or for all kinds of reasons cannot go any further and will settle there. Another example of that is very clear is Morocco. Morocco is a country of origin. We have a lot of Moroccans here in Canada. It's clearly a country of transit from the rest of Africa into the Mediterranean. And it's a country of destination, both by choice and sometimes by default. Now, the main countries of origin in terms of numbers, again, contrary to popular assumption, are not in Africa. They're actually in Asia. The number one country of origin for migration is India. And then after that, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the Philippines, of course, Afghanistan, these are among the top countries of origin. So number one is India, number two is Mexico, and maybe surprisingly, number three is Russia as a country of origin, which again, I think doesn't fit at all some of the stereotypes that people have that the entire African continent is on the move to join Europe. That is not the case. The main country of destination has been for a very long time and continues to be the United States by a very large margin. It has been number one country of destination since 1970, and in 2019 it received 51 million international migrants. And the number two country of destination is Germany. I'd like to say a few things now about how people move. And when I started looking at this information, I find it very startling. It's very informative, I think, when we're going to think about other issues. The key issue in the decision to move internationally is visa access. And I have a quote here from the IOM report. It says, nationals of developed countries can travel visa-free to 85% of all other countries. You can well imagine that this is not the case for nationals of less developed countries, which explains their recourse to irregular pathways. So visa access is one of the main determinants of access to international migration. The second, and so when I talk about irregular pathways, I want to flag here the danger of using not inappropriate language, but language that is easily hijacked for evil purposes, such as illegal migrants. I think in the literature, the convention is to talk about undocumented migrants or irregular migrants for those who entered, not necessarily entered. A lot of people can also enter with a visa, but overstay the terms of their visa and become irregular. Another point I want to make quickly, because I don't have a lot of time, I'm checking here, is what is called mobility transition. Certainly at the time we were negotiating the Global Compact, there were lots of voices in Europe, particularly from quite extreme right positions, who were advocating very strongly massive efforts to develop Africa in an effort to curtail African migration to Europe. The reality is that very poor people don't move. They're just too poor to move. And therefore, the first effect or consequence of development is increased migration, not decreased migration. It's a kind of paradox. But the literature now says, as more scholars are looking into it, this actually is probably a transition, because when countries then become more developed from very poor, in the phase of development, eventually this migration flow will reduce and people will stay. But then it gets us to the most surprising number that I think I saw looking at these materials recently, is that the main increase, not in raw numbers, but in percentages, the main increase in international migration comes from high-income countries, people who have a choice and who do move between high-income countries. That's where there's been the largest increase in mobility. But having said that, I've used a word that I try to avoid at all times. Rich people have choice. The word choice, in my opinion, is extremely misused. And I'll give you a quote. As I was looking at this will bring me to refugees. As I was looking at these materials, just to see what's out there in the literature, I just wrote, what is the difference between migrants and refugees? And the first thing that popped up, and I invite you to do the same, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, a migrant is someone who chooses to move, not because of a direct threat of persecution or death, but mainly to improve their lives through work opportunities, education, family reunification, or other reasons. Unlike refugees who cannot safely return home, migrants face no such impediment to return. Then I thought, who on earth wrote something like that? And it's on the site of UNHCR USA. Well, to me, this is an extremely oversimplified distinction. The real difference, in my opinion, to state it correctly, would be to say refugees are people who fall within the ambit of the Refugee Convention, and international migrants are the others. To suggest that a migrant who is not a refugee, that is someone with a well-founded fear of persecution because of race, religion, political affiliation, and so on, someone who's not that, right, then has a choice. It's completely oblivious to extreme poverty, all the factors that weigh heavily on people's inability to live and raise their children at home. So I find that very pervasive and very dangerous. And I would urge you to always challenge those who take that position. I have 12
Louise, une minute.
Yes, I'm almost done. So this brings us to home, and I hope the rest of the conversation will focus. We'll focus on, the work we've done and we are currently doing in support of asylum seekers and refugees, and the slightly more poisonous conversation we often have about the so-called economic migrants, particularly irregular migrants. The number of irregular migrants in Canada is almost impossible to ascertain, but informally, there are sources, including in the government, that suggest that there could be as many as 500,000 people in Canada who are undocumented. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to hearing the other panelists and answering your questions, if any.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Louise. You give a good example of keeping to the time. Norbert, over to you.
And just
Thank
one
you very
comment
much.
before you start, Norbert, just welcoming everybody. Should they wish, you're welcome to enter a question in the chat box, which is you can open up the chat at the bottom of the thing. If you have a question for Louise or Norbert, we're happy to compile them. Thanks so much. Thanks, Norbert.
Thank you. Well, let me start off by saying I'm sure many of you have read the novel Les Misérables by the French author Victor Hugo. Jean Valjean, the main character, is an extraordinary person. He is filled with compassion for the poor and works tirelessly on their behalf. But Jean Valjean would not have become the man that he is if it were not for a chance meeting with a bishop named Monseigneur Bienvenu. You see, Jean Valjean, when he was a young man, stole a piece of bread to feed his widowed sister and her 7 children. He was condemned to 5 years in prison, which was prolonged to 19 years in total because of his escapes and recapture. Upon his eventual release, he was a bitter, middle-aged man with few prospects because of his identity papers that showed he was an ex-convict. After a few days of not being able to find employment or housing and being looked down upon by everybody because of his status as an ex-con, he is welcomed to stay the night at Monseigneur Bienvenu's place. Even though Monseigneur Bienvenu acts charitably towards Jean by offering him something to eat and a place to stay, Jean succumbs to his rancor towards society as a whole by stealing Monseigneur Bienvenu's silverware and leaving during the middle of the night. Later the same day, the police pick up Jean and bring him back to Monseigneur Bienvenu's place. They ask Monseigneur Bienvenu if the silverware belongs to him. He answers yes, but that he had given it to Jean. And he also adds, speaking to Jean and looking directly in his eyes, you forgot the silver candlesticks that I had also given you. Jean is confounded by Monseigneur Bienvenu's actions and words. For the first time in his life, he has encountered somebody who truly showed him compassion, who truly loved him. That key moment became the turning point in his life. He then became the man who showed love and compassion towards the poor. How do we, each one of us, welcome the Jean Valjeans of this world, the ex-cons, the prostitutes, the migrants? When we see them, do we look the other way? Do we help them, but then condemn them if they return our kindness with misdeeds? Or do we show unconditional love and compassion towards them as Monseigneur Bienvenu showed Jean Valjean? Very few of us are at the level of love and compassion that a Monseigneur Bienvenu has. That's probably why we have so many problems in this world. But I invite you to pray. Pray for that grace to love the stranger and have compassion for him or her as a Monseigneur Bienvenu. You may be surprised by the gifts you receive. Now, I want to talk a bit about fear. Fear is a very powerful emotion. Many have stated that hate is not the opposite of love. Fear is. Why do we fear? More to the point for this talk, why do we fear the stranger? We often hear that the stranger is feared because he will take the job of the local. He is feared because he might be a terrorist. He is feared because there won't be enough housing for everybody. In essence, we fear for our security and we fear the unknown. We don't know this newcomer. And because we don't know this person, we fear her. We fear what he might do, and we fear losing what we've gained because the newcomer might get things like housing that is in such short supply. And because of this fear, we build walls, psychological ones and real ones. Imagine what would happen if we actually welcomed the stranger like Monseigneur Bienvenu did to Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean was a hardened criminal after serving 19 years for having stolen some bread. Life had dealt him a horrible hand. He was filled with rancor and was out for vengeance. But we know his life before his theft. He was a seasonal worker, a pruner. During the off-season, he couldn't find steady work. His income was meager. His sister's husband had died. He had to look after her and her 7 children. And so he stole some bread to feed them and paid dearly for this minor incident. Now, knowing Jean Valjean's story, you feel compassion for him. I would say that most people would probably feel compassion for him, or at least sympathy. Why? Because you know him. Monseigneur Bienvenu did not have that luxury. He knew Jean Valjean was an ex-con, but did not know his story. Notwithstanding any of that, he welcomed him, a stranger, in his house. Monseigneur Bienvenu had understood a long time ago that the real sinners are not the ones like Jean Valjean. The real sinners are the ones who create the circumstances that produce a Jean Valjean. And so, what will we do? Will we welcome the stranger? Will we risk? Will we make ourselves vulnerable as Monseigneur Bienvenu did? And if we are hurt, as Monseigneur Bienvenu was, will we respond with love and compassion as he did? Some time ago, I read an article that struck me profoundly about the welcome we offer to strangers. It was entitled, "Where is Home?" And the subtitle was, "It's a haunting question for both refugees and Christians." The author, an American Jesuit, describes a makeshift camp for refugees in Saint-Denis, just north of Paris. He is there to help the refugees. A local resident approaches him and his French Jesuit colleague and harangues them. The local resident disparages the refugees. They piss and shit everywhere, they might be terrorists, they rape children, and so on. The French Jesuit responds by saying that refugees have abandoned everything because of persecution, that they are desperate and in great need, that it is our duty to help them out. The answer that came back from the local resident got seared in the American Jesuit's mind. That is not my problem. The American Jesuit is struck by this answer and reflects on it. He realizes how often he himself has walked in the makeshift refugee camp, seeing all of that misery and saying to himself, this is horrible, but how is it my problem? What can I do about it anyway? As he further deepens his reflection, he realizes that the whole issue of welcoming or not welcoming the stranger is, at an instinctual level, a question of fear. The fear is not so much what is foreign about the stranger. The fear is more about how the stranger, the migrant, reminds us of our own fragility, that we too have a tenuous hold on a home. Even here in Canada, how many are one paycheck away from the streets? How many are forced out of their homes because of the flooding or forest fires every year? Indeed, the refugee may remind us all too well how our own lives could be dramatically changed in an instant. And so, how do we go from that is not my problem to that is my problem? Well, I think we must make it personal. We must try to live in the skin of the other so that we feel what he feels. And isn't that what Jesus is saying when he says, when you do something to the least of these, you do to me? Besides actually becoming a refugee ourselves, besides just imagining being in the shoes of a refugee, what can we do? Well, I believe we must befriend the stranger, the refugee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norbert. Right on time. Kathleen, if you could do your reminder again, and meanwhile, I'm going to bring up the slideshow for Minh.
Wonderful. Yeah. So we're lucky to be getting some great questions in the chat. Please feel free to add your questions there. And if there's someone specifically you'd like to direct it to, you can do that as well. Minh will be the final presentation, and then we'll move right into the question period. Over to you, Minh, when you're ready.
Thank you. I'm very thankful for this opportunity to speak out. And I realize that it's an occasion for me to recap my whole life. So I was born in Vietnam, and before the day, the April 30th, which is the date coming 49 years ago, in 75, I was raised I was born to parents, Catholic parents and teachers. So there's a long tradition being Catholic in my family and being teachers too. And I was also raised by French nuns, Catholic nuns. So that's speak a bit about myself this way. After April 30th, 75, the communists from the north invaded the south. And it was very hard for us because under the communist regime, and simply life is not life anymore. And also because we're Catholic. So like millions of Vietnamese at that time, we didn't have any other chance, to make a normal life under the regime than to flee. And my parents fled twice in their life. The first time in 54 from north to south, and now they are fleeing to the sea with us. So, well, it was not easy. There are traps, and we were imprisoned. My father from the prison was sent directly to the so-called education camp, because he was an intellectual. And my mom and the three girls, we were succeeded to leave Vietnam and arrive in Indonesia under very difficult conditions that you can read in it still has. I found a Newsweek paper, and they described the situation. We were pushed out in Malaysia, and they told us during the night to the southern point of Indonesia, and we beached in one small island in Indonesia, and then started the long journey, 9 months journey in refugee camps. But we considered being very, very, very lucky, not being pirates, not being all hardships, even with the local government. And finally, in the December 79, we arrived in the Galang transit camp, where the help from the United Nations were official. And it's the first time after 5 months that our eyes get used with artificial light again. So from there, life at the camp were very well organized. And for myself, I was trying to serve help to give back by teaching English, participating in church activities over there. And we were 4 of us because we spoke French already, so we chose to go to Quebec. And we were received by Quebec at the end of February 80. And we are striving for life and love in Galang. I want to show you Father Gildo Dominici, the late Gildo Dominici. He was our savior, a Jesuit from Sicily, a Sicilian, which has no fear to protect us from stolen monies from the local authorities, from everything. And so in Galang, we had quite a life, have church, we have a nice choir, and this camp has started in 79 and until 1996, when there's no more refugees coming because people have to find a solution with all those Vietnamese fleeing the government, the communist government from the 70s. Just a quick note, people are still fleeing now, today. So, well, but on my part, going to Canada, we were accepted. We arrived in Edmonton first for processing, paper processing at the Grishback military camp, end of February 80. And from there, we came to Montreal to start a real life from there. And for being homeless for 2 years in Vietnam before succeeded to leave Vietnam in 79, I have a new home from now on and a door to close behind each day. So with a new life in Montreal, we had the conditions to learn about Quebec with sponsors. We were received by members of the Club Richelieu de Boucherville, and through them, I think that we have a good integration, social integration into the Quebec life. And in parallel, I still have also a Vietnamese community activities with the Vietnamese community, and I serve the Vietnamese church too. So I think that those are, and after that, we were able to be reconnected to my circle of family and friends from all over the world, from the States, from Belgium, from Switzerland. And this picture you see is the nun who taught me English back in Vietnam, and she is still alive in Vietnam. So we were able to be reconnected after arriving in Canada. Next, you will see, life. I think that we have been through a lot of traumas, and consequences still follow us, even in the resettlement. There are my cousin Sus died, and another was killed in Paris. So traumas still come with us, but I think that thanks to Canada and to the free world effort, I heard Mrs. Arbour saying about that, and I'm very thankful for the effort from the whole world to help us to be resettled, to just have a normal life, to be able to serve again. So I was the most beautiful lifetime that I have here with my students, my colleagues, and I am very thankful for the conditions that I have been given to give back.
Thank you so much, Minh. That's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Kathleen, to start sorting through questions and posing them to our panel.
For sure. I think I actually hope to start with a great comment to open the discussion from Marion McLean, who wrote in the chat about St. Basil's own work that our parish has done with refugees over a number of years, and what the gift that has been to the parish. And it's a good reminder that actually, even before our parish was founded and built, the team that was working to found St. Basil's actually supported refugees escaping the 1956 revolution in Hungary. So there's a long history of support of refugees and refugee families from this parish, and understanding why that is so important to us. I'd like to begin with Louise, if it's okay, and ask her a question, more of a technical one almost. How does the Canadian government differentiate between refugees and immigrants in terms of its assistance? And also, specifically, are there grounds for refusal or deportation for those refugee claimants? You spoke about almost, so I'll leave that to you to explain.
All right. Well, right at the outset, there are two ways that people can come into Canada as refugees. One is through something like UNHCR resettlement program. So people may be fleeing their countries, they will land usually in the country next door or close by. For instance, currently in Somali, refugees may end up in Kenya, they'll be in camps, and then UNHCR will look at countries prepared to take them in. And so on that, Canada can actually set numbers, and they could say to UNHCR, we're happy to resettle 15,000 refugees. This, in a sense, is a very orderly, or as some people would say, a very safe way of taking in refugees, because they've been pre-selected. There's lots of time to verify their credentials and make sure that they're not a security risk. That's one thing. Another one, the more common, I think, all over the world, handling of refugees are people who arrive on your doorsteps and make an asylum claim and say, I need international protection. I'm on your territory. I can not go back to my country of origin because of a well-grounded fear of persecution on the basis of ethnicity, religion, political affiliation, and so on. In Canada, apart from this rocks hysteria, we don't have a lot of people who just, quote, show up. We don't have very accessible borders. I mean, there are some countries that have 7 or 8 borders adjacent to other countries. And what was seen in 2016, for instance, in Europe, is literally people walking in to a European territory, asserting their right to international protection. That creates an asylum claim, and it's dealt with. People who arrived at Roxham, and increasingly now that the government in its wisdom has decided to close that door of entry, people come, for instance, by air, sometimes with a visa that it may take a long time for them to obtain. And the minute they land, they make an asylum claim. They say, I cannot go back. I need protection. And then we have a system, in fact, quite a slow administrative system by which Canadian officials will determine whether there is a genuine fear of persecution, and the person will then be accepted as a refugee, if successful. If unsuccessful, well, typically they will be deported. So an order will be issued. In the US, as you know, there are lots of debates about whether these people should be detained pending deportation. That's not typically the situation here. And not surprisingly, a lot of people then go under the radar. When I say there are estimates of hundreds of thousands of people in Canada who are undocumented, some of them may be people who failed in their asylum claim because the government was not satisfied, that either because of the political situation in their country of origin, or as is often the case, for instance, in Central America, they fear affiliation with gangs. Anyway, there are lots of circumstances. If they fail, they are to be returned. The one thing in international law that's not acceptable is what is called refoulement. So if somebody shows up at your border, you can't just push them back. Then we have the safe third country agreement with the US. Anyway, there are lots of complexities, but roughly that's the way refugee claims are handled. All the others, so-called economic migrants, well, there's people who apply to come to work in Canada. Some apply for a full kind of permanent pathway to permanent immigration. Others are temporary workers, international students, temporary work visa. There's a whole series of people who don't claim refugee status. And on that, the government can set targets, either by discipline. So we need people in the construction industry, and as you know, there's the big debate about what is the magic number. And that's where sometimes the conversation gets very ugly. because migrants often become scapegoats for otherwise failed long-term social policies, such as adequate policies in lodging, in healthcare. And now, when we're in a crisis, everybody turns around, lock the door, don't take in any migrants, because they're the ones who are creating the shortages. The shortages came from ill-advised policies that did not properly anticipate demographic growth and so on. So that's roughly the difference between the two.
That's an excellent segue to the next question. You know, Louise just spoke, Norbert, about the magic number and the concern. There's really a growing unease if you look at public opinion polling in terms of Canada's immigration targets, and concerns like Louise just said about the benefits of immigration versus capacity issues on housing, capacity issues on the healthcare system. And the question from the parish member was about growing xenophobia that we see in other countries, and wondering, does that exist here? Is that a growing trend in Canada? And I guess I would add to that question is how would we stop that? How would we turn around that idea or prevent it from really taking root?
Yes, unfortunately, we are seeing an upward trend, if you will, here in Canada as well, in terms of the general opinion becoming more negative and unwelcoming towards refugees and migrants in general. It's certainly not to the same level as other countries, as in the United States, for example. I have a lot of Jesuit colleagues or Jesuit colleagues, I mean, people who work in Jesuit institutions that welcome migrants and refugees in the States, and for sure it is very significant and scary even in some parts of the United States. What to do about it? Well, one thing that we at JRS Canada have been doing for a number of years now is trying to raise awareness about refugee issues. We've started a simulation exercise called Journey into Exile, and it gives the opportunity of participants to actually play the role of a refugee. So during that an hour and a half of this simulation exercise, people get a chance to experience what it's actually like to be a refugee, and I think that can have an impact over the long term. It can take a while for many people to experience this, but we are making progress. We have had just this year over 1,000 people to experience this, and we're hoping to double that number next year. I think the more people that we have who experience refugees through sponsorships, like your parish, what you've been doing, I think, as I said in my talk, if you befriend a refugee, if you get to know them, you can't have the same opinion about a refugee anymore. If you actually get to know them, I mean, it just makes a huge difference, I think. So yeah, there's no silver bullet here. There's not a magic wand that will get people to change their minds. But I think that way of getting to know people, I think that's certainly one way of doing this.
Thanks. Louise, I'm going to try to combine two questions. I'm going to ask you to speak on the recent decision in the UK about the deportation of refugees to Rwanda, but also add a question by John Williams, who's asking, should governments be doing more or to basically mitigate conditions in the countries of origin that drive citizens to either become refugees over than the acceptance at the destination country? So kind of a double-barreled there.
All right, thank you. Well, I think the answer to the first question is very straightforward. It's completely illegal. I think the government of the UK has been told, in no uncertain terms, by the International Court of Human Rights, by its own tribunal, by its own Supreme Court, that it cannot do that. It's a classic case of refoulement, of pushing back people who come to your territory, where your obligation is to determine their status. If they make an asylum claim, you have to determine the validity of their status, to try to export that obligation and to send them. The UK Supreme Court said they're not persuaded that Rwanda, in any event, is a safe country in which they could be sent. And the government, by diktat, by law, declared Rwanda to be a safe country. To me, this is a severe abuse of the law. You cannot make the law say a reality. You can't make the law say that Sunday is Wednesday. You know, there are limits to what you can declare by law. So in any event, I think that's clearly illegal, but it's probably driven by electoral ambitions, which I hope will be defeated. It's not going to work. What was the second part of your question?
And just the idea of government should be doing more, to use you framed up in terms of origin country versus destination country. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think governments, certainly from highly developed countries, should do a lot to assist the development of developing countries, period. Not because it will keep these people at home. I mentioned before that the literature is suggesting that as you assist the development of very poor countries, in fact, in the short and medium terms, it will increase immigration. Very poor people are too poor to move. When they get the means to send a son abroad to make money for the family. So I think it's an excellent idea to assist in the development of less developed countries, but not in the hope of reducing mobility. I think we need to disconnect the two. It's just a good thing in and of itself to assist the development of developing countries. Now, the literature is unclear about whether, in fact, it will have, what kind of effect it will have on the ability to migrate. Because as you know, it's also linked to the brain drain, that the few people in developing countries who can access sometimes the development aid through NGOs and so on, through foundations, get the money to leave and then deplete the talent base of their home country. And then there's the ethical issue of whether you should force them to bring back home what they've acquired through the kindness of strangers, if I could put it this way. In any event, development is a good thing in and of itself.
Thank you. Norbert, we know that actually half Canadians who are born outside of Canada actually say they've received material support in some way from faith-based communities, which is really interesting, including help finding a job or learning a language, settling into a community. The Vatican actually talks about the idea to protect, promote, and integrate. And Bob is asking the question, I should just let Bob speak to it himself, but how those terms apply to the level of interaction between newcomers and the responsors. And maybe Minh could build on what you're saying too, on how we as a faith community work to protect, promote, and integrate migrants and refugees.
Well, I think Pope Francis has really been strong on this idea of refugees in general and being able to protect them, promote, integrate, and so on. I think first and foremost, as a Christian, as Christian communities, I think it's our responsibility to do all of those. I think if we are to call ourselves Christians, if we are to follow Jesus's message about welcoming the stranger and protecting him, I mean, we merely have to look at the Good Samaritan parable. We don't have to look further than that in terms of being able to say, well, we need to protect, we need to be able to welcome, like how the Good Samaritan stopped and took care of the person, brought the person over to the inn, made sure that everything was okay. I think we need to do that. It's not a question of choice. If we are to call ourselves Christian, we're obliged to do it. And I hear too often Christian communities question all of that, and it becomes that same political debate that we hear in the mainstream media in terms of, oh, isn't that there are too many of them, we're just getting overwhelmed, and so on and so forth. And I think coming back to what Louise was saying in terms of, well, we haven't prepared ourselves really for the demographic change that we knew that was coming. We haven't been, for example, we talk about the housing crisis, and we haven't prepared ourselves. Governments haven't been building housing for decades now, and now we find ourselves in the situation that, well, we're in a housing crunch and it's a problem, and so we're gonna put the blame on the migrants, the refugees. So I think that we need to kind of reverse that and say, okay, well, what can we do as a Christian community, and hopefully that it's not just one thing of the Christian community welcoming and having the refugee receive everything. I think it's a give situation there, and we need to work on that.
Min, did you want to comment or invite you to comment anything on, I build on that?
Yeah, I would say from a refugee, a newcomer stand, everything is not that simple, but I can see the determination of people when they receive me to befriend it with us, to keep the relationship. We still are like family until today. And through that relationship, that's how we can integrate it. We learn from everything, like Mrs. Arbour speak about development. And usually I think that people understand development under financial and in terms of economic terms. But I think about, as a teacher, I think about spiritual development, about personal development. And that is something that I think that over a certain time, the bond between people who receive refugees would help to develop that for at least for the second generation. Because like my son, sometimes he's got lost. Who I am, he's born in Montreal, but he speaks Vietnamese at home. And that's the generation. In my generation, we have an aim to work for, to work hard. And we have our objective, but not the next generations. So it's not simple, but I think that, as Norbert said, we have to. And I think that generation like mine, we have to give a hand to people who receive us to continue that work.
Louise, you spoke about the unique geographic nature of Canada. Like our geography just permits, we don't have as many crossings. It's hard to get to our country essentially. And so, but Mary raises in the questions the idea that, with increasing the climate crisis, and I would add to that conflict around the world, there will be an increase of refugees and migration around the world. And Mary's asking, how do you think that we can help open up our borders in light of the changing climate and the increased migration that will happen? What would you, if you were prime minister today, I mean, your resume has enough on it, but if we were to give you one other job, what would you do?
First of all, just one thing about the so-called climate migrants, of which they will be increasing numbers. And again, the literature, the studies that have been done have shown that, again, contrary to what people sometimes assume, the largest pressure towards migration will come from what is called the slow onset of climate change, desertification and so on, more so than the sudden onset, an earthquake or something that generates immediately, first of all, a lot of positive response, a lot of sympathy, aid, and the displacement is temporary. But the slow onset of climate change, I think, will produce over time very large displacements of population. Now, Canada, I think for all kinds of reasons, is already a country of destination of choice. I think in the ranking, we're about 14 or something like that. Again, people assume that everybody wants to come to Canada. Well, actually, first they want to come to the US. Maybe if they were better informed, we would be first, but that's for another debate. So yes, so I think we have to have, but you saw the conversation in Canada when they were numbers floated that Canada should take. Historically, Canada has always taken about 10% of its population per year, 300,000 when we're 30 million. Now the government has suggested, in my opinion, correctly so, that if we look at the demographics, and that's relatively straightforward, the number of birth and the number of deaths, and that's pretty straightforward. The only way you're going to sustain, and again, if we have an appetite for unlimited economic growth, we're going to have to support it one way or the other. I think the irony of the scapegoating of migrants on the housing crisis now is that we blame migrants for housing shortages, but we're going to need migrants to build houses because we have it's kind of, the world is completely upside down. And it seems that people have no shame in not recognizing the irony of the position they take. We don't want them in, but then we have to build more houses, but there's nobody to build them. So I think for all kinds of reasons, we should be looking forward to being positioned to welcome a lot more people. I think it's ultimately going to be to our benefit. If we are a serious international partner, when I talk about remittances and so on, it also alleviates, quote, the burden on Canadian to send development aids when we have a large migrant population that supports poorer people elsewhere. So lots of reasons. The key, though, is how to assainir, to make healthier the public discourse. And again, I would recommend this IOM report of 2022. There's a whole chapter on disinformation, misinformation, and what can be done to displace a lot of stereotypes and to bring into the public discourse information that is more likely to be conducive to adequate public policies. I mean, what I hear from Minh and Norbert, I think is critical, this kind of very humane, very charitable based one-on-one initiative. But this cannot be a substitute for robust public policies of a much larger scale, what I would call moving from charity to entitlement, and for that, in order to be able to do that, you have to win elections. And to win elections on this kind of platform, you need to fight disinformation and you need to mobilize and try to rebuild the trust. There's a distrust of the so-called science-based policymaking because there's a distrust of elites, distrust of institutions. So we have, I think, quite a challenge to move Canadian public opinion in the right direction. But I think that's an effort that we have to do collectively.
Wonderful response. Thank you for that. We're up against time, but I'm hoping I can ask both Norbert and Louise to answer this question about human traffickers that Kathleen Kelly has raised. The idea of, can you speak to the dangers and some of the unrealistic expectations that come with human traffickers and what your experience, if anything? We'll begin with Norbert, if it's okay, and then to Louise.
Sure. Well, Louise referred to Roxham Road at some point, and we know that Roxham Road was an irregular entry point for asylum seekers who wanted to come from the United States to Canada. And all of this because of the Safe Third Country Agreement, and the government had initially had this put in place, this agreement with the United States back in 2004, but it was only applicable to the official entry points. So everywhere else, people, refugee claimants, asylum seekers, they could cross the border and claim refugee status once they arrived on the other side. Now, since last year, March 2023, they renegotiated the agreement and it's applicable now to the whole border. Now, since then, what we've anecdotally we've heard is that there are many more traffickers, many more gangs of traffickers who are working to sell the idea of coming to Canada irregularly with their help, obviously. And so I think whenever governments tend to or enact laws to prevent migration, then you're going to see an increase of people, of traffickers, of illegal things that are going on that are much more dangerous. And I think that's really unfortunate.
Kathleen, can I come in, add a few things on this? I think we have to be very careful about terminology. I was saying about the illegal migrants is very dangerous because illegal sounds like criminal, very bad. I think the same thing, there's the idea of smugglers and traffickers, it's all bad people, it's all very dangerous. We have to remember two things. First of all, remember Schindler's List, all the heroes who saved Jews during the Second World War by smuggling them out of Poland, out of Germany, right? They were smugglers, not traffickers, but they were smugglers. So the question of kind of purity of intention, I think, has to be kept in mind, that we cannot just put together in the same category people who assist asylum seekers or refugees. The second thing one has to keep in mind, that for an asylum claimant, so not someone who already has a UNHCR refugee determination somewhere else, but somebody who flees his or her country and enters another country, entering illegally does not preclude the making of the claim. In a sense, by definition, you sometimes have to enter. You have to flee your country illegally. If you ask for an exit visa, again, the Second World War is the classic example of that. The Nazi Germany's project was to exterminate all Jews. They were not very keen to let them go. So entering a country, quote, illegally, that is without the proper documentation, is all right. And therefore, helping someone to do so may also be okay. I know it sounds a bit counterintuitive. What I think needs to be addressed much more seriously than it is currently is trafficking in human beings, not just internationally. There's human trafficking for sexual exploitation within countries. So I think we need, again, to dissociate these ideas that this is all again linked to migration and it's all bad. Human trafficking is a terrible crime, but it is not necessarily linked to international migration. It's linked to sexual exploitation of undocumented migrants who are exploited in the workplace because they have no workplace protection. They're underpaid. They're under the radar. That's, I think, much, much more undiscussed and unaddressed than I think the issue of assisting people to cross borders illegally. This is just something to keep in mind.
Thank you so much. And we're actually at time, so I'm going to pass it to Terry now, who's going to wrap up and thank our incredible panelists.
This afternoon, we've been gifted with a critical examination of the issue of international migration and the plight of refugees from three fundamental perspectives. On behalf of the St. Basil's community and our larger audience, I'd like to thank our three presenters and our moderator, Madame Arbour. May I thank you for your wise and cogent analysis and advice based on decades of high-profile responsibility in national and international law, justice, and human rights. The debate surrounding international migration and human rights could not have had a more passionate and knowledgeable protagonist. We are most fortunate to have been able to welcome such a distinguished and forthright anchor for our discussions this afternoon. Norbert, your work with JRS Canada is truly where the rubber hits the road. Thank you for sharing your insights with us this afternoon and for your challenges to us as Christians. We'd like to also acknowledge that we have benefited profoundly from the valuable awareness raising and the advocacy work done by JRS Canada over the years. And in particular, your telling of the parable of Jean Valjean was quite searing. And it makes us, ask ourselves, do we have the grace to love the stranger? Minh, you are a wonderful example of the reasons for international migration and the results achieved by countries sponsoring refugees. Thank you for sharing your journey and making it real for us. Your successes since arriving in Canada, your giving back to the communities in which you have lived is emblematic of the millions of refugees who have come to Canada since its founding. Canada is richer for you and for all refugees. And finally, thank you, Kathleen, for the skillful and professional way in which you moderated today's panel. we benefited from your years of high-profile experience. Thank you all.
Thank you, Terry. And over to you, Father Gerald, for some closing words.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob, for your participation too with the technology. I think not all of us are skilled like that. I want to say that we, in addition to Terry Tunney's beautiful remarks and gratitude for our speakers today, that we are doing this, well, our concrete way to thank our panel today is that, first of all, our parish is going to make a donation to a charity or an organization of Madame Louise Arbour's choice. And it will be a donation given on behalf of her by our parish to this organization. Secondly, we want to give a donation also to the Jesuit Refugee Service for their continued and important work to help this world to be a better place. Finally, it's become kind of a tradition in our program that I have a niece. You know, my mother was Indigenous, and we lost a lot of our culture because of policies of assimilation in our country. But the generation following me, my nephews and my nieces, they're trying to relearn and reclaim their culture. And I have a niece who does beading. She beads all kinds of beautiful projects, beautiful items. And I'm sorry I don't have the completion of those. She's working on them now. She's beading her away now. But what she's beading are 3 images of a turtle, because Indigenous people refer to North America as Turtle Island. And the Indigenous people here never believed that it was just for us. We always believed that we could share it. Now, I'm not saying it was paradise in here before, you know, but when settlers came 500 years ago, we negotiated ways and boundaries and how we would live together. Unfortunately, those weren't always honored, but we never thought that others coming here, the land was big enough to sustain us all. And so when my niece finished these turtles, we're going to send them to Madame Louise Arbour, to Mr. Norbert Piché, and to Madame Minh, all as a gratitude for all of their work to make this land, to make this world a place of sustenance for all of us, where it's big enough that we can all live here without fear, without economic deprivation, and with respect and dignity. So that's the thing. Now, finally, this was our final conversations for our time at this season. And we are happy to announce that Conversations for Our Time will continue next fall. Starting in the fall, we are already planning a series of conversation events and are pleased to confirm that one of them will be the acclaimed author and commentator, Michael W. Higgins, who is quite well known in the Catholic world and beyond the Catholic world. He will be talking about Pope Francis, and as a pope who has been making vast changes, not only within our church, but within the globe itself. So thank you for all attending today. God bless all of you. May we all be mindful that this is a land that we can share with. There's enough land and enough resources that we can share this with people who are in desperation, find themselves in desperate times. Thank you all. God bless.
Thank you. Have a great Sunday. Take care.
Bye-bye.